So I'm going to introduce Louise. Louise Thompson, who you can also see spotlighted next to me, either to my left or my right, or either above or below, depending on what device you're watching on. Louise is a pupil barrister currently based in London, is from Stamford originally, and as I said earlier, is chairperson of the Stamford Anti-Racism Group. She studied law at Newcastle University and was called to the bar in 2019. Since then, Louise has worked as a volunteer with the Arizona Capital Representation Project, supporting lawyers working on death penalty appeal cases in the US. In many of these cases, Louise has visited or spoken with clients who were on death row, and I'm sure we'll be highlighting her experience of these cases in our conversation about the film Clemency this evening. Hopefully, as I said before as well, many of you may well have seen Clemency or just finished watching it. For those that maybe haven't had the chance yet, the film's focus, it's a sort of understated prison drama, and I use understated as a good term there, written and directed by Chinonye Chukwu, who's an American filmmaker, starring Alfre Woodard, and it centres on the experience of the people working in a death row prison, or a prison that has a death row facility, and the effect on their lives that these executions have. I suppose the interesting thing, or one of the most interesting things about the film, you may well agree, is that it's a representation really of the people who are enacting these executions, which is potentially quite rare for a film to portray. Before I jump straight into asking you questions, Louise, was there anything else that you wanted to mention about your own self or the film?
Nothing about myself, the film. I think you've covered it very well. I just wanted to highlight at the outset that actually it happens to be the anniversary of George Floyd's death. I'm sure everyone heard about his case last year. So I just wanted to acknowledge that from the outset, because that sparked the Black Lives Matter movement to go global. Ironically, George Floyd is one of the more fortunate cases in the sense that his killer was held accountable for killing him, whereas in most cases, the killer is not held accountable. So just from the outset, I want my thoughts to be with George Floyd's family and anyone else who's been a victim of police brutality, where there has been no accountability or any form of justice. And hopefully throughout this Q&A session, you'll see some links to how this is relevant to the Black Lives Matter campaign. But other than that, feel free to ask away.
Well said. Thank you, Louise. I wanted to ask then briefly, just from the beginning, on the off, the film, as I sort of said in the introduction, is, I think, slightly different in the way that it represents the US death penalty. And obviously, originally, some of you may know, the intention was actually to focus the discussion tonight on a film called Just Mercy, which is also based on a book, and that might come up in a bit too, but which was specifically about one person's fight against the miscarriage of justice. But what was your opinion, or just your thoughts initially after seeing this film, Louise? And was that the fact that it was focusing, on these people that enact the executions, as well as to some extent the character of Anthony Woods and his own experience, was that something that you felt was surprising? Or I'm interested to know, what were your thoughts initially?
Yes, it's very unusual to see it from the perspective of the people actually carrying out the execution, and that is because executions over the years have become more hidden. They used to be very public, and now they've kind of gone behind the scenes, so many people don't really see the perspective of the people that carry out the executions themselves. So I think it was very useful to see that, but also see the impact that it has on those people carrying out the executions. What I also noted was something that was raised in my training before I went out, was the fact that there isn't actually one person that does every step of the process. You have lots of people involved, and Amicus, which is the UK-based charity that I found out, got my internship through, argue that this is because there's not a person that wants to be 100% responsible for another human being's death. So that's why the process, they set out different stages, people that take the person to be executed into the room, strap him down, and then different people put the injection in the body, and someone else is overseeing the process. So they separate out the accountability of actually executing that person, because I think essentially no one would want that job where they have 100% accountability for that. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting perspective, but I also think it's a good insight into seeing some level of acknowledgement that not one person wants to kill another human being, so they have to separate out the roles.
I mean, that's fascinating to hear you say that, because that was something that initially occurred to me. I mean, the opening scene of the film and the closing scene are these two executions that we see in the film. The film is bookended by two executions, which, you know, in some way I think is almost a taboo to show in film, especially in terms of the method of, you know, this lethal injection. You know, when I think about other films that have themes of the death penalty or of, you know, this sort of, or a set on death row, like, you know, even famous examples like The Green Mile, or most recently, My Days of Mercy is another one that I mentioned in our last Cinema Speak. Those that were there will know, but you don't actually, you know, always sit, I mean, you do in The Green Mile, but this was interesting in a way because, especially, we had just mentioned it previously, the final execution of Anthony Woods is not something we see in Anthony. You know, we see him strapped to the table and the horrors of that. But otherwise, you know, the focus of the camera is on the reactions of these people around him. And that was my impression too, I suppose, that there were a number of people there and not one of them was necessarily doing all of the, is procedure the right word? It doesn't sound like it, but the act itself.
Yeah, no, yeah, you're 100% right to pick up on that. And I think that is very deliberate because, well, you can see the impact it had on them anyway, being involved, in the mental health impacts that had on the people in the room, let alone if they were the 100% sole person that carried out that act. So it's definitely a deliberate procedure and logistical process put in place that not one person can feel 100% to blame or accountable for it. And
as far as you're aware, was this a pretty accurate representation of at least how, you know, some procedures are carried out? Again, procedure doesn't sound like the right word here. I never actually saw an execution, thank goodness. But from what I was taught and trained, that is exactly how it is carried out. Very different steps and processes carried out by different people. And actually, one thing they seemed to touch on as well was how things go wrong. And actually, the lethal injection, out of all the methods of execution, actually has the highest botch execution rate at around 7%. So yeah, it's not too unusual for things to go wrong or it to take longer than they expect, and therefore for the process to be quite traumatic to witness. And recently, some people may have heard how there's been shortages of certain drugs that are used in the lethal injection dose, which has meant they've had to kind of play around with different combinations, which as a result has led to more botch and traumatic executions. So it wasn't for dramatic effect, essentially, to see executions go wrong. They do often go wrong or take longer than expected. Well, I mean, that is also intriguing to hear you say, because I mean, it's a horrifying you know, opening scene of any film anyway, and I'm sure you'll all agree, those of you who have watched it, you know, you're on the edge of your seat right from the off, you know, knowing what we might be about to watch. And then as it gets worse, it feels worse, you know, the horror really does set in. So it's fascinating to hear you say that, Louise, but I wonder what the significance of it is here. And maybe you could speak, because some of what was going on was a little over my head. I don't know whether your own, you know, knowledge of the US death penalty would help to explain that. But during that scene, what is going wrong? What's the cause of the botched?
Well, I think it can be various things can go wrong. It could either be the calculations, so it's an incorrect dose, so it's taking longer than it should. I know I've heard of some cases where they've used different combination of drugs, where they don't put them to sleep beforehand, or the dose to put them to sleep isn't strong enough, so they're still very much awake. And you can hear encounters of people that survived an execution, and they're very much alert and aware to what is happening. I think I've heard one person say that it's like they feel like their veins are on fire. What I find interesting about the whole trying to reduce the number of botch executions and trying to find a humane way to kill someone is essentially, it's a pointless task, because there is no humane way to kill another human being, and you can't kill another human being without them being in pain in any way. Maybe that's an acknowledgement that what they're doing is potentially wrong, because otherwise why would you be trying to find a humane way to do it? But yeah, essentially it can be a variety of reasons, a miscalculation, or because the combination of drugs isn't doing what they're meant to do. But yeah, it just depends on the individual.
Speaking of the individual, in the film, the two executions that we do see are both of racial minorities and people of an ethnic minority. What's the significance of that in this film, would you say? And obviously, given part of the topic of race this evening, in your experience, is that something that is, more so in one group than another?
Yes, definitely. There is a massive over-representation of ethnic minorities on death row. I think the statistics are that a Black person is 4 times more likely to be sentenced to death than a white person. There have also been jury studies which show the darker your skin colour, the more likely you are to get the death penalty. So for example, me being mixed race, so a bit lighter skinned, I would have a bit more luck on my side than, say, someone that was darker skinned than I am. But actually what I found most interesting from my training was that it's the victim's race that can actually be the biggest factor in determining whether someone gets the death penalty. So if the victim of the crime, so if the murdered person is white, that means you're 4 to 5 times more likely to get the death penalty versus if the victim is Black. And so if you look at interracial murders, as they call it, where the victim and the murderer are of different races, you see a massive disparity. Since 1976, 21 white people have been sentenced to death for killing a Black person, whereas since 1976, there's 297 Black people that have been sentenced to death for killing a white person. So it's actually the victim's race that is the biggest factor in determining whether you get the death penalty, which is why the Black Lives Matter campaign is relevant here, because it shows that Black people as victims aren't as valued as white people, because the perpetrator is less likely to get the most severe penalty. Not that I'm for the death penalty in any situation, but it's basically showing murderers of Black people get a lower sentence.
That's horrifying to hear, and I think it's an interesting note in the sense that in the film as well, we don't actually see any of the victims, or especially of the main case of Anthony Woods. We hear about the case and we hear about the accusation and what he's been found guilty of, though obviously a main theme in the film is that he professes his innocence to it, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But in the sense of, you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement, is that because this film was actually completed in 2019 and finished and released, so it was not before the Black Lives Matter movement started, but before the murder of George Floyd. So what's the significance of this film now, to you at least, Louise, in the sense that, although it might not be being seen by as many people a year or two after its release, given the events of the last year?
I think it's more hard-hitting for people. I mean, I went to America in 2019, so I was quite aware of the racial disparities of the death penalty prior to that, and that was one of my main motivations for pursuing an internship. But I think what it shows is that there is a high proportion, well, as you said, the two characters that you see being executed are ethnic minorities, and they are very much overrepresented on death row. Which in my view shows the severe abuse of the state's power in trying to essentially target ethnic minorities. But yeah, it has a lot more relevance to people who may have only just become aware of these types of issues in the past year or so. They can see that this is supported by evidence. It's not unusual for ethnic minorities to be executed.
Just to move on slightly to another point, I was fascinated by this film initially, and I remember being really keen to see it when it was initially released. And I think many of you may well have watched it, or you might have seen it that we were screening it on the Stamford Arts Centre website. By the fact that, you know, the film's protagonist, Bernardine Williams, the character's name, played amazingly, I think worth mentioning, by Alfred Woodard, who I think is just an incredible actor, and is a criminal offence that she was never ever nominated for an Oscar. But that's by the by. I wonder what your opinion, Louise, is of the significance, we've touched on this already, but that the protagonist is on the side of the state, and also the fact that she's a woman and a black woman. And is that something that's represented in reality, or is this something that we don't see as often? And what was the effect that you felt that had on the film itself?
I think it really did add another layer to the film, because you can see the conflict she has within herself, especially in the Anthony Woods case. My interpretation was that she definitely believed that he was innocent. And she would not be oblivious to the fact that Black people are overrepresented on death row, and therefore she will be involved in executing a lot of Black people. But also there's that conflict with, she's actually a Black woman that's been relatively successful in her field to get to the position that she's in, and therefore wants to do her job well. And yeah, it was really hard. It made it harder for me to watch, because it made her harder to dislike. I think if it had been, you know, who you would expect, or just not a Black female, I probably would have found it very easy to dislike her. But by making that character a Black female, and you can see the sympathy she has, and you can see that she'll have an understanding of the injustices that happens on death row, it makes her more likable as a person, because you can see that conflict between wanting to do her job well, having worked very hard to get to that position, but also acknowledging the injustices that she has to carry out as part of her job and duty to the state. So I thought it made it a very interesting watch, and made her less of a villain in my eyes anyway.
Absolutely. I would agree with you. I would say that despite her role, in some ways she's completely the antithesis of a villain, because her commitment to it is so, well, is steadfast at the beginning, but obviously as the film goes on, we see wavers, perhaps just underneath the surface. But I think that's what makes these scenes with her husband, again, played very well by Wendell Pierce, but, you know, so interesting, because she's so committed to her profession, as she corrects him. You know, it's not a job for her, it's a profession. And I think that conflict then makes it all the more fascinating for us. And I'll be interested to hear a few of your thoughts later on, everyone, as we open up to questions. Just a one more, or maybe one or two more from me before we do open up. Just a reminder, if you would like to ask any questions, either about the film or to Louise directly, by all means pop them in the chat now. Equally, if you don't have a question but you just have an observation or an opinion or thought about the film, or any of the topics up for discussion, you're more than welcome to share that too. So we've touched on this and the case of Anthony Woods, who is a fictional character created for the film, but as I understand it, Shinoye Chukwu, the writer-director, based it on a case that she first found out about in the early noughties, of a man who was on death row and who had a huge public campaign in the outside world trying to prove his innocence. I think one of the fascinating things about the film, aside from what we've already said, is that we never really are given a straight answer as to whether Anthony is guilty or innocent. And my understanding, at least, of the film is that it's really up to the viewer to decide. And as you said, Louise, your opinion was that Bernardine seems to feel within that he is innocent.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know what, I mean, why you think that was. Why is it not overtly stated? And then also, what you think generally, you know, are there many miscarriages of justice as you understand it? And if that is what we would call this in the film, within the criminal justice system? And I suppose an extra question, what are the causes of those?
Mm-hmm. Why don't I think it's overtly stated? Probably to show, well, A, because they want to keep the viewer guessing, but also to show most of these cases may not be clear cut. And sometimes there's severe doubts that someone is guilty, but there's also a lot of evidence against them. So what do you do in those scenarios? And I think that was what they were trying to get us to think about. My view, obviously, is that you rarely can be 100% certain that someone is guilty, and therefore don't risk killing anyone, because there is a strong likelihood you can kill an innocent person, even if the evidence is strong against them. It definitely happens a lot. There's definitely people on death row who are innocent. I guess it depends on your definition of innocent as well, because there are a lot of people who are legitimately on death row for murder, but actually have not killed a human being. For example, there are people that were getaway drivers from the scene that are on death row. So they didn't actually kill anyone, but there are laws that mean if you're part of the group involved in killing someone, that you can go to death row in certain states. Two of the clients that I visited were both claiming innocence, saying that they didn't physically kill anyone. Yes, they were there, but it was the person with them that physically shot or stabbed the person. So in my eyes, they are innocent. They may not be innocent of all crimes, but they're innocent of the crime of murder. I think there is an estimate of 1 in 10 people in death row are innocent, especially as forensic science has improved over the years. We've had a lot of exonerations from death row as DNA evidence has advanced. I think there's been a total of 185 people exonerated, found to be fully innocent of the crime since 1976. And of those 185, 99 of those people are Black, so over half of them, which shows that if you're Black, you're more likely to be sentenced to death of a crime that you're innocent of. So yeah, innocence is a huge issue. There are definitely, as I say, there are definitely people on death row that are innocent. There's definitely people that have been executed that are innocent. And then there's also those cases where you're not sure. And the criminal standard is meant to be, I'm sure everyone's heard it, beyond reasonable doubt, or so you can be sure. But I think there are a lot of cases where you can't be sure, and yet they've been found guilty and convicted just because people don't understand the standard of proof, as they call it, in the criminal justice system. What was the last question that you had? Sorry. think I've answered.
Well, it was really just asking, I suppose, why there are these miscarriages of justice, but I think you've answered that as best you can, not to...
Yeah,
no one
I
can
think there's lots of factors into it because there's so many stages to the process. There can be police misconduct in the investigation where they don't investigate all the leads, they just find one potential defendant and really pursue that, you know, confirmation bias or for whatever other reason. There can be misconduct with the prosecution. So one of the main roles of the prosecution is to disclose evidence to the defence, and in particular evidence that proves the innocence of the defendant or doubts or raises doubts to the prosecution's case. And there are some cases, and this causes miscarriages of justice even in the UK, where the prosecution do not disclose that evidence, and therefore the defence do not have evidence of their client's innocence. You have juries that don't fully understand what their role is, and what standard they need to be sure to convict someone. I think we try in law to make it as clear as possible what that standard is, but so you can be sure means different things to different people. I might think sure means 99% sure, whereas someone else thinks it means 75% sure. So I think there's miscarriage of justice because of that. And also there's a really long jury selection process in a death penalty case where they argue over who can be a juror and who cannot. And that can mean that you hear of these cases where it's a fully white jury trying a black defendant, and that is a deliberate action by the prosecution because they know it's easier to convict a black person if the jury is all white. And especially of death, because the jury have to be unanimous of the view that they want to sentence someone to death. So if one juror doesn't think it's a death penalty case, then that means the person won't be sentenced to death. So they're very set on getting a jury that are for the death penalty. So there's lots of stages that can cause miscarriages of justice. I think racism is a huge part of that, but there are also issues around prosecution's misconduct and the police misconduct, which can also cause miscarriages of justice.
As a side question, and just out of interest, I don't know if you know this, Louise, but how many states is it legal to enact the death penalty? Is it?
Yeah, so it changes all the time, actually. I think it's now only 24 states. I say only, it's quite a few states. 24 states that have the death penalty, and then 23 states that do not. And then there's a few states that the governor of that state has said that they're not going to sign off essentially on any death sentences or executions. So I think California is a well-known example of that, where technically you can sentence someone to death, but the governor hasn't carried out any executions for quite a number of years. So legally you can sentence someone to death, but the governor at the moment is not doing that. So yeah, there's a lot of nuances, but I think it's 24 states still have the death penalty, 100%.
Wow. That's 26 too many, in my humble opinion. But there may be someone here who disagrees, who knows? I've just realised, Galaxy J6, that I stole your question. My sincere apologies to you. Harriet, if you're happy, I'm quite happy to go through these questions. Harriet is our tech assistant and wonderful marketeer of the Festival of Social Justice, repping the festival with her yellow cap. Joe, would you like to ask your question yourself, or would you like me to read it out to you? I think you had the first one there.
Sorry, do you mean me?
I do, yes.
Oh, right, okay. But I can't even remember what my question was. I was so... yes, so yes, I know what it was. I was so absorbed in everything else. Yes, because Louise, who happens to be my daughter, by the way.
Hi, Mum.
Because she said there was no humane way to actually kill someone, it made me think about, so what does that mean for euthanasia? Are there any medics in the room, or anyone who can answer that question? Because, you know, you do hear about euthanasia and that being a humane way of letting people choose when to end their life. So it's just an observation.
A good one, and you can always trust the mother to ask the
I
hard
know,
question.
it's a tricky question.
Go on, Louise.
Okay, so what does that mean for euthanasia? I guess they're very different issues because there is that element of choice of the person dying. So I would still say there's no humane way to kill someone. There's probably ways you can make it hopefully as pain-free as possible, but I don't think there is a pain-free death. But the person electing to do that, if they're going for euthanasia, would hopefully be made aware of that. I'm not sure what my stance on euthanasia is, but I would say it's very different in the sense that that person's electing to do that will ideally be made aware of the risks and therefore can make an informed decision about whether they want to go ahead with that, versus the death penalty where it's the state executing their power over an individual, and in my view abusing their power because they don't have the right to kill or torture anyone. So that I think over the years we've tried to make it more humane, and I do think potentially the lethal injection is more humane than the other methods used in the past, but I wouldn't say it's 100% humane. But yeah, it's slightly different due to the element of choice.
Thanks. You.
Thanks, Dave.
Is there anyone else who'd like to jump in on that? Joe did invite anyone else who might have medical experience, or you're more than welcome to give an opinion of that. If not straight away, then by all means pop it in the chat box. We're quite happy to have an open discussion. I'm going to scroll down, so please do continue popping your questions in the chat box if anything comes to mind as we go through. It'd be lovely to hear from you all, even if it's just a thought or opinion about the film, as I said earlier. Yvette, I think your point was next. Did you want to voice it out loud, or were you answering a question? I got halfway through.
Hi. No, it wasn't really a question. I just sort of quoted an Amnesty, the Amnesty position on why they oppose the death penalty, and about it being discriminatory. So the quote was, the weight of the death penalty is disproportionately carried out by those with less advantaged socio-economic backgrounds or belonging to a racial, ethnic or religious minority. And this includes having limited access to legal representation, for example, or being at a greater disadvantage of a criminal justice system. So I suppose if there was a question to come out of that, it would be what your personal experience, Louise, is of dealing with clients, and were they of a less advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds generally? You did already say yes, they did belong to other racial, ethnic, religious minorities and so on. What about the less advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds bit, or the limited access to legal representation?
Yeah, so yeah, my experience is that there's no one rich on death row because you can afford a good lawyer to make sure you don't get there. And that actually goes to the legal representation point. I think a lot of people have the misconception that only the most qualified lawyers will be asked to do death row cases, but actually what we find, a lot of defendants have a lot of young, fresh off the block, fresh out of law school lawyers defending them. And as a fresh out of law school lawyer myself, I would not feel anywhere near qualified or prepared to do a murder trial in this country, and yet people are asked to take a defendant's life into their hands. So actually one of the main things that my organisation, the Arizona Capital Representation Project, does is actually to help train lawyers on how to conduct a death penalty case, because they don't get any training on it necessarily before they have to do it. So it's one of the key things is to get lawyers trained up on how to conduct those cases, which is also why they send interns like me to help them, because it's a lot of work. In terms of racial, ethnic or religious minority backgrounds, yes, again, I actually had a couple of white clients, but they were from very poor, disadvantaged backgrounds with some of the most horrific childhoods I've ever encountered or heard about in my entire life. And it made me form the view that actually most people on death row have been failed by society in some way, most likely as a child, whether that's been exposed to abuse, neglect, or just any form of disadvantage. And so we failed them as a society, and yet we've decided that because they have made a mistake, if they are guilty of that mistake, that they don't deserve their life, when actually if we had stepped in sooner to support them, maybe this wouldn't have been the outcome. Which is why I see it as a huge abuse of the state to fail someone and then kill them for their mistakes. So yes, there is very much low income, and there's an overrepresentation of ethnic minority groups. For example, in Arizona, it was a lot of people from Mexico that were on death row, or overrepresented on death row, because that's the main ethnic minority group in Arizona, because it's so close to the border. So yeah, it very much confirmed what Amnesty said, my experience.
Just as an off question of that, Louise, what was your opinion of the legal representation of the character in the film, played by Richard Schiff? Was that someone who you felt was an accurate portrayal as far as your experience or knowledge goes, or?
Well, what I didn't or can't remember from the film is whether he represented him at trial, because what you'll often find is they'll have different lawyers to their lawyer at the initial trial who takes on their appeal, and usually it is more experienced lawyers that take on the appeal cases. So he seemed, very well equipped and very well versed in the death penalty, from what I can remember from the film, and that is representative. But from my understanding, most of the time at the initial trial where the jury is deciding guilt or innocence, it's usually not the same lawyer that then goes on to appeal, often because one of the main lines of argument for appeal will be what they call ineffective assistance of counsel. And I don't think you can make that argument against yourself, saying that you were rubbish. So yes, you do get very experienced lawyers, but they often unfortunately come in at the appeal stage rather than the trial stage. So once they've already been sentenced, and it's very hard to get them overturned when claiming innocence, because the main avenues of getting your sentence overturned is by a legal procedural error or misconduct. So you have to prove something actually went wrong at the trial rather than proving your innocence.
Right. Okay. Well, that's fascinating to hear as well. It was interesting to me because I think you're right. We don't necessarily understand from the film, at least, whether we know we're given the impression that this lawyer's been around for a long time and they've been through a long old legal battle, and that obviously that they're nearing the end of. But we're not given the information, at least as far as my memory serves. Maybe if there's someone else who was more eagle-eyed watching could correct me on that, by all means.
Well, to put it in a bit of context, the cases that I was working on, the murders happened in the 80s and 90s, and I was there in 2019. So to get from the point of being convicted to being executed is very, very long. It's a very long appeal process, which is why it costs so much money.
That is an extortionate length of time.
Yeah. It's crazy amounts of time. But yeah, I was looking at evidence from the 80s and 90s, before I was born, essentially.
Yeah.
Were the cases.
Just moving down the list then, this person hasn't got a name, but I will know you as Huawei P30 Lite. You had an interesting point. I didn't know if you'd like to voice that. You're more than welcome. Otherwise, I'm happy to read that out.
Hello, I am Huawei 30p Light, otherwise known as Poppy Reynolds, and my claim to fame is I'm Ben's mum.
Oh, there we go. All the mums in here.
So I'm a nurse, and I feel that I would like to say to those of you who are listening that I am very anti the death penalty, but I am very pro voluntary euthanasia. Which is different to euthanasia. And in my medical experience, because I'm a nurse, I would say that it's interesting because there is always the option to anaesthetize the prisoner, the patient, to essentially give them a general anaesthetic and put them to sleep, and then to administer the lethal injection. And I was very interested when I was watching the film. I was watching medically what was happening, and that didn't happen. That there wasn't a general anaesthetic administered. So I don't know why. I don't know anything about how lethal injections are administered in America, other than my very limited looking at watching on television. But that's something. So obviously, from a medical point of view, if you anaesthetize somebody and they were effectively under the general anaesthetic, you would then have the option of administering whatever you wanted to cause them to die. So I suppose that would in some way be more humane than what we witnessed in the film. So that was my observation. But what I wanted to say was that I really found the film fascinating, because for me, it was a film, I haven't watched a film in a long time where the dialogue was, in my opinion, secondary to the acting. I thought that there was, the first half of the film particularly, there isn't a lot of dialogue, it's very minimal, but so much is conveyed through the acting alone. And for me, that was the standout thing from the film, that it was brilliantly acted, in my opinion. And that's all I have to say.
I agree. Maybe it's to try to show how hard it is to vocalize how you feel about these things, and how difficult it is to discuss issues like this, because they are really contentious and very emotive. But yeah, I agree. I did notice that the dialogue was definitely minimal.
And I liked Bernadine very much as a character. I really liked her. I think it was brilliant that she was a woman, brilliant that she was Black, and seeing all her sort of personal torment. I really liked her as a character.
I think that's all interesting. Yeah, I think that's a very good point to make, a few good points to make. And Louise, as you said too, I know I agree. I think one of the interesting things here is that, and this is potentially why I said at the beginning that, you know, as an actor, Alfred Woodard was not sort of nominated for an award, because not that the awards are be all and end all, but when you know, there are certain scenes in these sort of awards movies where an actor shouts something really passionately, and that's like, oh, that's the Oscar scene, you know. And this film doesn't have that, because the performance is so understated, you know, and we see this in the climax of the film, you know, when Bernadine is brought to tears, and this is just my opinion now, we're seeing her break down, you know, but we don't, it's so, you know, because when you cry as a person, you're trying not to cry. And, you know, when an actor cries, they're trying to show you that they're crying. And I think that was the brilliance of this performance, and what makes it so effective, and us as an audience, but maybe you had a different opinion, you know, so involved in the emotion of it, because we're feeling it with her. You know, we can see her suffering and trying to hold it all in and keep it at bay. But no, I'm glad that was a point that at least a few of you have noticed too. Galaxy J6, moving on to you. There's lots of phones here this evening. Nice to have you with us. Oh, we answered your question already. My apologies. Moving on to Philippa. Did you want to ask a question, or would you like me to read it? Hello.
Hi, happy to ask a question. I think I was just quite shocked actually by the amount of states that still have the death penalty. I hadn't realised it was as high as it currently is. And I'm just interested to know, in your experience, Louise, from being out there, do you think there is much of a change in public opinion? And do you think with the new democratic government out there, that will make any impact at all, and whether there will be more support to change the view out there?
That's a good question. I know President Biden himself is against the death penalty, but the issue is the states essentially decide themselves whether to have the death penalty or not. So it's decided on a state-by-state basis. I think it'll be very hard for the federal government to intervene on that. what is interesting is that most countries that have abolished the death penalty, including here in the UK, they abolished it when popular opinion was actually for the death penalty. And I think it's only very recently that we've had a majority of people here in the UK who state that they're against the death penalty. I would say in the last few years, I saw an article that we just flipped over to 50% of people here being against the death penalty. The thing with America is their constitution is very much a focus on we the people and giving power to the people. So I don't think states will even really entertain the idea of abolishing the death penalty unless their particular state has that majority view. But what we have seen is that states do abolish the death penalty, and some states have done it very recently. So it is possible. And I think one of the main things that does change people's minds are the innocent cases where people are exonerated, or where they find out after the execution, maybe years later, that person was innocent of that crime. And I think that is something that is flipping people's opinions and saying, oh, is it really worth having the death penalty if there's such a high risk of killing an innocent person? So I think in the states where the penalty still exists, the death penalty, that is, usually popular opinion will mean they are for the death penalty. However, you will see it decreasing, and you will see that governors, for example, are saying they won't carry out executions, and I think that will have a big impact on popular opinion. But I do think it'll be a while. For example, I very much expect Texas to be the last state standing advocating for the death penalty, because they execute a lot of people every year, and they're very pro it. So it will be on a state by state basis, but I'm hopeful that maybe in my lifetime, if I live to 120, we might see America without the death penalty. But unfortunately, I don't think President Biden will be successful in abolishing it in all states. But you never know.
Thank you.
Thanks, Philippa. Miranda, you had the next question. Miranda Green, would you like to pose it, or would you prefer for me to read it out?
Yeah, happy to pose it. Hi. So I was just wondering, Louise, hypothetically, if you could reform the prison system tomorrow, how would you go about it? Obviously, this is the US context, but just in general.
How would I go about it? I think both in the US and here, I'd probably reduce the number of people that go to prison. So I think sentences, I think there was talk in the UK of abolishing sentences less than 6 months. I'm very pro that, because I don't really see what a 6-month prison sentence does other than ruin the individual's life. So it means they lose their job, their house, and everything, because they're not able to do anything for 6 months. I'd reduce the number of custodial sentences. That doesn't mean I'm against them having any form of sentence, but I would see it more as a community sentence, where we actually focus on the potential cause of them turning to crime and trying to address that, rather than just putting them into a cell for a certain amount of months and hoping that they come out a totally reformed person. I would also put a lot more focus on rehabilitation over punishment. As much as I understand that as a victim of the crime, you'd probably want to see that person punished, I don't really see what benefit it does for wider society to just punish someone without attempting to rehabilitate them. And I think there's very few people who commit crimes that are beyond rehabilitation. And even if we think they are, I don't think that means we shouldn't attempt to rehabilitate them. So I'd see a much greater focus of rehabilitation in prisons, whether that's in the form of mental health support, greater support on when they come out of prison and what they can do and how they can actually move forward with their life and actually look at the root causes of why they commit crime. And I know it'll be different for each individual, but often it is the classic poverty factors and mental health issues that mean people commit crimes. So if we address those, we can reduce crime in society, in my view, and reduce the level of reoffending. So yeah, I would probably reduce the amount of prison sentences for definitely petty crimes or the less significant crimes, and have a focus on rehabilitation and support once they leave the prison system as well.
Thank you, Miranda, for that question. I think we've got about 4 or 5 more questions to go, so I think we'll probably do those and finish up. But if you'd like to, put any more observations in for people to read as we're talking, then by all means, please do add your thoughts. Lucy, I think you had the next question. Would you like to voice that?
Hi. Yeah. So my questions was around dignity and respect, and it came out of a thought I had at the start of this talk, which is I work with in a forensic mental health unit with men, many of whom have committed murders, and it hadn't occurred to me until now that if they had been in America, some of them might have been put to death by now, or will have been put to death, and that is a horrifying thought. But also, they are treated with such respect at where I work, and their needs are very much put first. The staff take a lot of time to understand them, their background, them as a person, and we have this person-centered care approach where they are at the center of their care, and they're treated with respect, to the degree where we have community meetings where if they say they want the heating turned up that afternoon, the heating will be turned up. If they say they want a smoked salmon and cream cheese bagel, they will get a smoked salmon and cream cheese bagel. And that just seems crazy to me that in America they could kill people that are in the same position as them. And what was your experience in America in terms of how they were treated by the everyday staff? Did they have that compassion and empathy for them, or did they see them like they're portrayed in films as kind of lesser people and treat them like dogs, etc.?
I have to say, I think it was a mix. Actually, one of the first interactions I had with a client, he was complaining about a prison officer that he thought was picking on him. So there definitely is that essence of, prison officers can pick on the inmates. And that was something we had to try and address once we left that meeting with him. But then he does also talk of prison officers that he considers quite good friends. I guess, well, when you're in prison, you don't have many friends. So sometimes the prison officers can feel like friends. So I think it definitely was on a case-by-case basis. My interactions with the prison officers, even going into visit, wasn't great. They are definitely trying to intimidate you. And definitely, I mean, they even wrote up the person that I was going in with for wearing a sleeveless dress, even though she had a cardigan on as well. They're just very much on a bit of a power trip, in my opinion. That's just my perspective. But I think to say they're all bad would be a misrepresentation, because there definitely are prison officers that are compassionate and care about the inmates. But definitely there are prison officers that don't care about them and do potentially pick on them. I think actually where you see the most compassion is, strangely, on the day of their execution. They seem to be treated with a lot of respect. Not that I've witnessed that personally, but just from people talking to me, they seem to all change their demeanour on that day and are very much more accommodating and empathetic on that day. But yeah, it's a mix. It definitely doesn't sound like your experience. I wish it was. But yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Lucy, for that point. Galaxy J6, another one that you've posed a good point there. I don't know if that was a question. You're more than welcome to voice the observation if you'd like to. I think that was next.
It was just an observation.
Thank you. Okay, no worries. Mish, I think you had the next point. An interesting one. Would you like to voice it?
Yeah, okay. I mean, it was just an observation as well, but yeah, I did just think that the narrative of the woman struggling with the emotions of the situation is a bit cliche, and especially being a Black woman. I know you say like it's understandable that she'd have the empathy, but I do think it would be more powerful if it was somebody far removed from his demographic that understood, I think that'd be more powerful. But yeah, just an observation.
I think
That's a good point.
Go on, Louise.
Sorry, yeah, I was going to say that's a very good point. Actually, maybe if we'd seen, as you put in your question, a white male who struggled with it and was empathetic towards Anthony Woods, it may have been even more powerful. yeah, maybe it was a bit predictable, but I guess you would see more, I guess there would be inevitably more conflict with a black female performing that job than someone from a different demographic. But as you say, yeah, maybe a bit predictable.
And especially being a woman in a powerful position, you know, there's always that she's got a great job, but she can't do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. Well, what I found interesting though is that she did do it.
Well, she did, yeah.
So I kind of saw it as, you know, women, even though we're portrayed as more emotional and she was seen to be emotional, she still managed to carry it out, which isn't necessarily a weakness. She still has the strength to do her job or perform her duty. So I guess even though they showed her as like an emotional woman, I don't think it showed her as a weak woman.
I think that's a good, both of you have brought up some fascinating points there. And Misha, I see what you're saying completely. I wondered if that's the point of Anthony's lawyer, though. He's that white male character who is showing a huge amount of empathy to Anthony. And we're almost getting that perspective, but not from the point of view of the warden. And then there's also this really interesting character of the deputy warden, or whatever his title was. And his and Bernadine's relationship is a fascinating one. We haven't touched on that, but they go drinking together and almost have this sort of informal side to their relationship. I think those are the only two white men in the film, but Bernadine as a character has an interesting relationship with both of them. And I would say is definitely the more powerful of the three. But again, that's just my own observation. I'm just moving on. I know that we're hitting about an hour here, but hopefully we can just squeeze in a few more questions. Thank you, Mish, for your point. That was great. Who was after? Yvette, you had a point just about just mercy. Did you want to voice that?
Hiya. No, just that was a really brilliant book and film, and I know that the book was it was a true story, and it was written by this Brian Stevenson, who did actually form the Equal Justice Initiative. So I just wondered if Louise had any personal experience of that, working there or anything like that, or knowing anyone who worked there or anything like that. That's all.
No, unfortunately, I didn't have any experience with the Equal Justice Initiative. However, the lawyers that I did work for know Brian Stevenson well, because I guess the lawyers in the death row appeal case community it might be quite a small community. So I know they know him and they mentioned him, but in my 4-5 months there didn't get, I really would have loved to meet him, but I didn't get the chance to meet him or do anything with the EJI. But obviously it's very well known.
JJ, you had a question to Louise next. Did you want to voice it, or would you like me to?
Maybe me, actually.
Oh, sorry, Anne.
Me manifesting as JJ.
By all means.
Yeah, Louise, I know that you said something earlier about why they wanted you there, but I wondered not why you wanted to go, but presumably you had to win this internship. Presumably there had to be some purpose, and as a British lawyer, that's interesting. And then I wanted to know about the impact that it had on you to be there.
So why did I want to go? I mean, I've always been so fascinated, I don't know if that's the right word, by the death penalty, because I just think it's so outrageous, and I've watched every documentary I think there is going about it, so I was always interested in it. But as someone that was qualified in the UK, I knew there wasn't really much I could do unless I decided to qualify out in the US, which I think my parents would be very unimpressed by, in the sense that I've been in a different country. So I was very motivated by the racial disparities, and I did think by working on this particular area of law, it'd be very rewarding, because I think sometimes lawyers can get a bad rep, especially in particular areas of law that they're just, you know, pursuing money, whereas I've been very focused on actually wanting to achieve justice or prevent a miscarriage of justice. So that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to do the internship. And because it's such an underfunded area, and such an overwhelming amount of work to do, lawyers working on appeal cases always need help. And therefore, there is a UK charity that finds people with law degrees here in the UK to volunteer and go and support them, because they have at least got some legal training, and then you just train them in the US system. So that was why I decided to go over there, because I thought I would be of some use to do some of the laborious tasks. What impact did it have on me? It's a tough one. It's very hard hitting to see or to witness, I guess in paper form is more the way I witnessed miscarriages of justice happening. For example, a lot of my work was to look into the original evidence and see if we can find evidence of police misconduct or prosecution misconduct. And I have to say, in some cases, it wasn't very hard to find. So that just kind of made me angry in a way, that people would put people's lives at risk just to get a conviction so that they look good. So in a sense, you sometimes lose faith in humanity, but then you're working with people that fight against that every day, so that kind of restores your faith. And then there's the other element of, I was reading a lot of evidence about someone that was murdered, and that is very hard hitting, because at the end of the day, someone has already lost their life. And one of the cases was a child. One of the ones that I was reading, the victim was a young girl. So I found that very hard to read. But it just made me more hungry in my own legal career to do the kind of law work that I think makes a difference and has a positive impact on society, and has made me more hungry in my own career to pursue justice. But yeah, it's had a lot of impact on me in many ways, but I think overall it's a positive one, and I have more faith in society than I don't, if that makes sense.
That is that's a very well said well said answer. Thank you, Anne, for the question. I'm sorry, but I think we might have to leave it there for questions. Thank you to those that posed them. Sorry to those that may not have been able to get an answer. I've been following along the discussion, and thank you for that too. As we round up then, just a few things to say. Thank you to everyone who's, well, thank you to you all for coming along and for supporting the local Stamford and Rutland Amnesty International group, as well as the festival itself. Thank you to Jane and Harriet, who I can both see, for all of your work putting it on. Thank you for asking me to host this evening. I do really appreciate it, and it's been great and really hard hitting but fascinating to hear all of your opinions and thoughts as well on the film. And of course, thank you to Louise for all of your wonderful insights and for speaking about your early career, and to obviously the Stamford Anti-Racism Group. Louise, is there anything you'd like to say before I finish up?
No, just thank you for everyone for attending, and thank you, Ben, for hosting. You've done a fabulous job.
Bless you. So just a few things to mention before we finish. Thank you, Louise. Just a brief unabashed promo over the next few events for the festival. There's Pint of Poetry tomorrow evening, which is a regular event of ours at Stamford Arts Centre, but this week will obviously be themed around social justice. There's also the Hope for Justice talk on modern day slavery, and that is on Thursday. All of these events are on the Stamford Arts Centre website, so please do have a look there for more information if you're not signed up already. They are all free. There'll be a sort of info, a follow-up email that just will send out to you all, that will come in the morning, just with a few links to topics of discussion that we've talked about tonight, and some more information if any of you are interested to find out about. So by all means, please do have a look at that and look out for it in your inboxes tomorrow morning. Also, just to say that please do follow the festival on social media, and if you'd like to hear more, let them know, and they can add you to their newsletter list. Please do follow Stamford Anti-Racism Group as well, and Stamford Arts Centre. And just as a final plug, if you've been enjoying the discussion about the film specifically, as I said at the beginning, I run Cinema Speak with lots of you who are here this evening, and we talk about films every other week or so. It's a bit like a book club, but for films. They're not always themed on hard-hitting subjects, but they are all hopefully interesting. And it'd be lovely to see some of you there. So by all means, do join us. The info for that is also on the Stamford Arts Centre website. Jane, Harriet, am I forgetting anything? Was that all? I think we're good. Okay. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for supporting the festival. I hope you found it interesting tonight, and thank you again, Louise.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.